Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This Parley is a follow-up to the previous Densoro Parley about the miniaturization of technology and how it perhaps has caused a trend where depictions of fantasy fiction, uh, techno-magical stuff in media have become very loose on detail. You know, because we have supercomputers in our pockets, perhaps Densora suggests that a lot of the benefit of including the details of how weapons or gadgets or magic work, and including those things in character designs and all sorts of things, mechanics in games, have kind of left our media a bit in their eyes. And in that parlay, I focused on a certain thread, which was contrasting how there are some good reasons why people have done that. That's not all bad, which wasn't exactly what Densoro was looking for. I'm going to read their response. I want to talk a little bit about doing follow-ups or like mulligans to parlay, and then we're just going to talk about some stuff more, because I do have more to say. I said in that previous parlay, for example, that I would be interested to talk more about the strengths of digital approaches rather than analog approaches that sort of show their work when you're using a weapon or something. But there's kind of a further point there, which is about finding a fit for a piece of media. That when Densora and I talked about this after the first parlay, we both thought that was an interesting subject to cover, so we're going to do it. If you haven't seen the first parlay, again, the topic we're discussing here is basically just the idea that including details in your character designs, media, games, helps ground things. There's a lot of benefits to including the nitty-gritty bits of how a weapon works, or, not being able to pull things out of thin air. Having things feel mechanical adds a lot of detail to media. It's kind of such a reasonable point when you put it that way, that it's difficult to see what there would be to discuss. But the point is, there's a lot of media that has maybe noisy detail. That is, there's a lot of detail, but it doesn't really do anything. And there's also a lot of media that's kind of stripped that out, or maybe oversimplified those things. Streamlined, you might say, if you wanted to be positive. But anyway. And that forgetting the benefits of including all that detail has many consequences. So picking up from there, I'm going to read Densoro's comment reply to the first parlay video, because that's kind of our prompt for this one. Densoro says, "Oh, I absolutely agree that these things are only situationally forgotten, not globally. I'm not saying all media is this way so much as I'm saying sometimes media is this way, and here's why sometimes I find it unsatisfying. Your call out to Arknights is a really good example of modern media that's analog without fussing over realism. Bagpipe is absolutely pushed in a way that I find compelling, because that 50 caliber battering lance defines her silhouette really well. The revolver wand on Absinthe is another banger weapon design. Plus, I really like Arknight's designs in general, with that sort of tactical athleisure fashion. It gives the setting a distinct flavor and atmosphere. Ads for Arknights avoid looking like 20 other gacha games by not going the come and play my lord route." I laughed even when reading that off camera, because it's good. I wish I liked tower defense games more, because I really love this game's aesthetic. And again, for an example, here's Bagpipe. I used Bagpipe as an example in the first parlay, as an example of, I think a lot of Arknight's designs are quite busy, but you can see that pretty much every element of Bagpipe's design here does a lot. It's not a sleek, simple design. It is busy, but the detail is, used for something, which is really mostly what Densoro was saying was good. You can see here we've got her totally unrealistic. I don't know how you would use this. I believe this is a siege weapon. It's like to break open a door or a bunker or something. She just hits people with it in the game, but yeah, I think it's a siege weapon. They don't maybe go into that much detail about that. And yeah, you can't use this without probably getting killed for the recoil punching through your chest, But they included a stock where if it wouldn't kill you to fire this weapon against your body, you could perhaps absorb the recoil and break your shoulder. They have you can see like the barrel where all of the ammo, like near her head, there's that like drum barrel thing, kind of looks like a grenade launcher magazine, right? So okay, that's where the shells go. And in her hand you might be able to see she's holding two of they're called fort cracker shells. They even have that detail. She has a big tactical vest that has tons of pockets for presumably these shells. You can see they've done this. If you squint really hard, you'll notice the gigantic steam dragon boiling out of the breech of the spear. So I guess it's been fired, and now it's releasing the pressure inside. And that's become this badass dragon behind it. If you look real close, you can see the entire design dominated by a steam dragon, and even other elements of her design that aren't really realistic still do things for her character. For example, Bagpipe has this thing where she's like a very serious military operative, but she's still she has kind of a hick thing going on. She's not at all ignorant or slow or anything, but she's not a like nuts and bolts technologically savvy kind of person. She's meant to be this world's version of Irish too. A plaid skirt and her red hair, for example, like those details, maybe it's impractical to have hair that long, but that detail is there for something. It just isn't necessarily there for like how she kills people with the unusably self-damaging battering spear. Yeah, and so this is an example of a design where there's a bit going on, but all of it kind of tells the story's character, the character's story. Even things like her shoes, you know what I mean? They look like something that would be functional, but they also look a little bit casual. Bagpipe is a fun person. She has that kind of, what are you doing around these parts kind of way of speaking, which I don't know. I feel like this design says that, but also says, she's in a Western military. That is a pretty okay way to tell that story with a visual design. So yes, I thought we'd focus on this for a little because it's a fun example. I should have used this in the first parlay. The tactical athleisure moniker you added, I thought that was very good. Anyway, continuing on with the prompt. Densoro says, and yeah, I can absolutely handwave physique. Like, it's cool to see buff-ass women who make you believe they could handle these nonsense weapons. But slender bishis can absolutely play ball too. The contrast of a twiggy ice cooler and a 100-pound weapon is the point of that particular aesthetic. I'm absolutely not a hard numbers realism person. I'm no good at estimating that stuff. I just really value touchstones, even if those touchstones are hilariously impractical. Sell me on those sick-ass battering lances. I want to believe. Sidebar on the optics thing. Throwing a cloak over your warframe in Warframe so that people don't immediately know you're a Warframe is one option that could add some nuance to engagements. But the reason you used player in your prompt instead of frame is because enemies aggro to your operator or drifter instantly as well. It could be really cool to pretend to be a regular person, Hitman style, and then transference in and fuck shit up. Indeed, a point from the first parlay was this element that warframes are very difficult to hide. They're legendary war machines that can defeat hundreds of people by themselves. So it's quite unlikely that anyone in the origin system in Warframe will see a Warframe coming and do anything other than run away screaming or shoot you. And you could maybe try to cover up with a cloak. But Densoro makes the reasonable point for that perspective that happens even when you're not in a Warframe And of course, that's just because that's the focus of the game. But that type of nuance, it's a small thing, but it would be interesting. I don't think it would be a huge balance change to have your operator drifter, if they were seen first by enemies, maybe not immediately draw fire. Though, personally, I don't think that's really worth the effort for Warframe, but we're going to get to that subject later. Continuing on. You said, I'm concerned about how I came off in the latter half of the parlay, though. And, overall, I think a lot of this, Densor, what I hear is that I think I accidentally made you feel like you're more of a hardliner about this subject than you actually are. And so we're getting to that later, but that's part of why I'm happy to do a redo and talk about this more. There's plenty more to say anyway. My Optimus Prime example wasn't intended to be representative of everything, just a sort of example of it going poorly. I find Michael Bay's Transformers shallow, blistering hot take. Nobody's ever said that before. But I think the response here pivoted on that and put a lot more pessimistic lens of shallowness on other media than I necessarily intended. Densoro didn't say this, but I did that. Yes, this is a point at which I interpreted it, maybe reasonably, but not the way you intended, as being much more negative about the shallowness in other media. Densoro continues, I adore Disco Elysium's art direction because, as you said, the clutter is more purposeful there. It's a masterpiece. I just don't think Michael Bay's clutter is used as thoughtfully. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree. A paragraph got skipped, not intentionally, that makes my tones sound less bulldozerish. The third paragraph under encumbrance explores the benefits of zero encumbrance characters, especially as terrifying outliers in an encumbrance-based setting. This contrast gives them more identity precisely because we can't identify them on sight. The aforementioned Hitman Tenno thing would fit nicely here. Yes, I believe I did read over this one, and the reason was that at this point in reading the parlay, I thought that I had understood that you really disliked this trend toward oversimplifying, the mechanics shown in media, and so I felt like it was just going on about that point. But now, having had this discussion with you off camera, I understand that this was meant to be you explaining why it can be good. So I'm going to read it. If a character doesn't have to care about encumbrance or what they're carrying, they should be broken as hell. They can walk in the front door completely unarmed, morb out, and suddenly they're a literal military tank. Like Nightcrawler teleporting through the White House in X-Men 2, such a character should be an existential rule breaker, a glitch in the reality of the setting. Through spectacle creep of these no encumbrance characters, though, it becomes the new baseline, and encumbrance as a concept is forgotten. Right, so I don't, as I'm reading this, I may have read this in the main parlay, but the point is I didn't emphasize it the way you meant it, which makes total sense to me. This is here to present contrast. Yeah, it could be really cool to have a character that didn't use, what feel like grounded, nuts and bolts mechanics for their weapons or the way they take their actions. They teleport, but they have no gear that lets them teleport. They can just teleport. That's obviously sometimes fine, but the story kind of warps around it. That would be huge. That would be a huge, meaningful thing. When the story doesn't warp around it, it feels like no one is encumbered, but they are though, and that creates this lack of context for that level of power. I did. Accuse is a strong word, but using it here, I did suggest that you were giving only some reasons for why it's good to add these details, and I would really want a lot for both sides. If something isn't going to include any detail for why things can be so powerful and they just happen, you're going to Thanos snap people. There better be a good reason, and if you're going to include that detail, that should also have a very good reason. It's not good in and of itself, but this is kind of a good example of when it kind of is good in and of itself. Just by having that detail some of the time and then not other times, you create real contrast. A very simple example of this concept I've experienced recently, since you seemed to enjoy the examples previously, they've been useful in this discussion, is Jujutsu Kaisen. Sorcery Fight has a very important character named Gojo, and Gojo has this totally insane ability. Spoilers for the first season of Jujutsu Kaisen. It's good. Skip a minute ahead if you don't want the spoiler. He basically can't be touched while he's activating his ability. He makes you approach him slower and slower and slower forever, and so you never reach him. And that all-powerful, repulsive, and he's also got an attractive force, means that he can obviously perform ridiculously powerful attacks by basically firing, black hole repulsion and attracting forces at you. And he can do this for days on end. And there's a titular point in the second season, again, a spoiler for that. You can skip ahead a minute if you don't want it, where he, on the verge of death, basically learns how to invert his own energy entirely and regenerate from a fatal wound, which makes him extremely high from like the endorphins, I guess, as he ascends to like nearly godhood. But the key with all of that detail, spoiler period is over, so hopefully that's been about a minute, is that the entire plot of the story revolves around the fact that he is hilariously overpowered with no build up that we see on screen. Like, we meet him when he can already do these things for the most part. But that's like a gigantic plot point. The second season or whatever part we're on now, the whole thing is that for like 4 episodes, a guy is meticulously organizing a situation where it is even possible to damage this person, which takes all that effort. And it takes many, many, many steps, very active steps, for him to be worn down enough that he'll stop using the technique. And then even then, he knows he's getting attacked now, so he'll turn it back on. And how do you counter that? But he's tired enough that you just have maybe have a chance. And the enemy has to have abilities that can't be easily detected. And the entire story contextualizes that, so it feels, it's like a different version of something feeling earned, I guess. And it's because the story has context for needing to be encumbered, I guess is the term I'm shifting toward. The opponent that Gojo's fighting needs to, carry their weapons around and use all these very specific nuts and bolts tactics to deal with this ridiculously overpowered ability. And that's why it's cool. Like, I think that's why it's fun. It doesn't feel ridiculous when he just trivially overpowers everybody, because the setting has put that into context. And the entire story, there are characters. I think another big thing is there are characters smart enough to respect that ability. Another example would be something like the metagaming that should happen if you have a character in your story that can just teleport into the White House, to go off your example from before. The security should be completely different to account for that. They just have to be. It doesn't matter whether this happens often or not. If they know about that and they don't act differently about that, that is unbelievably stupid. Like, that is setting breakingly stupid. That it's not fun. And so I completely get what you say when you say sell me on the battering lance thing. I want to believe. There's a mix of rule of cool as well, like the way that Bagpipe smacks people with this lance when you use her as a gameplay unit. I mean, it just looks so badass. I'm kind of willing to just forget about the obviously body destroying levels of recoil. And she is meant to be canonically like a very durable person. Not sure the design totally does that. I guess she's got the tactical vest, but anyway, she's like a normal sized person, so I don't know, but anyway, whatever, she's unnaturally durable or something. But the point is, it's just really cool. And so provided that there's an effort made to contextualize that, we can look aside. And obviously this is also an element that is particular to people's preferences. You may have more or less of an appetite for these things. That can wiggle it a little, although I actually think that point is more objective than people act like it is. Like, what is the threshold of, people being willing to suspend their disbelief? I actually think that's pretty objectifiable, and although people do have different thresholds for what they'll tolerate, they're not that different, I don't think. I can't really know for sure, but that's just my sense. Another element, though, is this point about, you have characters in your story that can do these crazy things, but there's still an element of making it, I don't know, like having there be a narrative reason why characters have these abilities. In a lot of shows you get the realization that the fighting is only interesting because of the context behind it. A show that does this really well is World Trigger. This show frequently skips over extremely large sections of its plot that would be tons of action, but wouldn't be very meaningful action. And then we'll jump ahead to, it's still a show with an absolutely insane amount of action in it. But it frequently jumps over very large amounts of what would be exciting to watch from a visual perspective, because it doesn't really mean anything. The character is just training, or, we need to see him have a rematch with this one guy, but we just need to know how it goes in general. We already know how the fighting is going to go broadly. We already saw them fight when it was the first time and there was this meaningful plot point happening. There's no need to go through all of that again. If the show has a more meaningful fight scene to show you, which it does, which is one reason I like that show a lot. And then, of course, the final detail I think is relevant here is this realization. For me, this was from Sword Art Online. Sword Art Online is a show about being trapped in a video game. And I think that by basically every analytical metric, it's not good from like a writing, literary, art perspective. But the thing is, that doesn't matter to almost everybody. What matters is whether or not their desire for the fantasy is high enough for them to look past the bad things. Sword Art Online isn't magically well written. It doesn't magically have lots of character development for other people. But one, you may have a different threshold for what is relatively better character development than other people. And two, if you really want a story about being trapped in a video game, I mean, I thought the first episode was cool. Like, all right, sure, this is an adventure we're going on. I just feel like there's not enough after that, or I just don't want that badly enough to tolerate. I really don't like this show, so I'm sorry. It's okay if you do. That's sort of my entire point. I don't want that enough to tolerate that. But it doesn't really matter, I would argue, to most people, whether or not, it's good, essentially. It just matters to them whether they want it enough that it doesn't break. Nothing about it is bad enough that them wanting it a lot gets broken. They can still enjoy the fantasy, and that's fine. I think that Densoro and I both share a quality that we are maybe less willing to just say, oh, but I really want to enjoy a movie about Transformers, and therefore I will look past, quite a lot of flaws. For better or for worse, there's no superiority here, but for better or for worse, I just am not really enjoying the piece of media if it doesn't put much effort into like being good, I guess. I don't know. Why? Why is it not about what's in the media and instead it's about how the media is constructed? I'm not entirely sure what to tell you. I mean, yeah, from my perspective, it is shallow to only care about the premise. Sure, I suppose. So for example, it would be like saying, well, that you went to an amusement park is more important than like whether the amusement park was fun. You know what I mean? Now, as I say that, it probably occurs to a lot of you, I think most people do care about that more. Like when people talk about these things in their life, they usually focus on, I went to the Grand Canyon, not how good was going to the Grand Canyon, right? It's that they've had the experience, not how they had the experience. Whereas I think that the specific experience is completely irrelevant and it only matters how you had the experience. To put it a different way, I once heard this quote. I think I mentioned this in Parley before. I once heard this quote that really troubled me, where someone said, it doesn't matter, it only matters what you like, not why you like it, when you're trying to date people. This was dating advice. And I thought, that is the exact opposite of what, like, it is utterly irrelevant what you like. It only matters, why you like it, or the mechanics of you enjoying it. Like, you're not going to find a partner that just magically has the exact same preferences as you and have them be a person that's a good fit for you. You're either going to have all the same problems, or those interests will be fleeting. They're not what really matters deep down. Over the course of time spent with them, all that will end up mattering once all the little circumstantial things go away, all you're left with is what is at the core of them enjoying those things. Why they like those things, how they think about things, is all there is to them. They aren't anything else. Because you're basically going to share all the same experiences if you spend your time living together. Not all the same experiences, but you get the point. So it was weird to me. I think that's a difference here. I feel like for Densoro and I do think we agree about this subject now that we're revisiting it again. The problem is that it feels like Transformers, maybe for example, doesn't care about why at all. It's only there to be so you saw the Transformers movie, not so the Transformers movie was like good in this way. And why that is, why people won't talk about the details, basically, that's a whole other. I mean, I don't even know if you could fit that in a parlay, really. But it's troubled me for a long time, and I do think it's related to this subject. So, yeah. Let's finish up your prompt. But just to say, yes, I think that is an incredibly good point, and not overlooking that because I had read something into your parlay a little bit did mean that I went significantly off the direction that I would have if I had focused on that paragraph. That is ultimately why I'm willing to do a redo. While my job, when I make parlay, is to interpret the prompt, it's possible that somewhere along the line I will make an interpretation of one part that just jostles me off the path of what you were interested in enough that I kind of don't do the rest of the parlay. So even though I talked about things for a lot longer than I normally do for parlay, that are on topic for your discussion, I agree with you that it's worth revisiting. I feel like this one has been fun for one thing, and I've got plenty to say about this subject. Certainly, I could easily do more about this one. But yeah, it's not so much about, if I interpreted somebody's parlay in a way that I argue is completely reasonable, free of defect. It was my interpretation, maybe a bit weird, but not derailing the discussion in a certain way. And somebody were to say they didn't like it, I would have to say that's what the product is. I have to be allowed to interpret it the way I have something to say. But in this case, I feel like it was the way that I chose to. If I'm gonna pick and choose, it's important for it not to be in a way that skews the entire message of the parlay. And I do also feel like, for Densoro, it's not fair for them to seem like they overly cared about this kind of thing or were like too much of a hard ass about this subject, right? So I also think it's nice because you get to hear their totally grounded opinion about this subject. I didn't at all mean or think that it was like extreme or stupid in the first parlay, but you have something different you wanted to say, and that's part of the point too, right? Like people want to share a thing when they get parlay. So yeah, that's the situation in which I've done in the past and will in the future, on rare occasion, do a redo, or kind of a follow-up. Just to close out with the similar thing that Densora had to say. You said, I probably worded my analysis a little strongly. Most of my statements here probably would have benefited from the qualifier at worst, but I think we all have an all X are Y, but not all Y are X desync. I'm not saying that all digital designs are quantitatively worse, just that it's a design focus that faces certain qualitative challenges. Much like how analog designs can get bogged down, tedious, and legalistic sometimes, but not always. I suppose the latter also gets in the way of empathy by splitting hairs over carry weight instead of engaging with the characters. Yep, that's a major point, including more detail. One of Densora's problems was that they feel like including all this detail kind of removes some humanism from the setting, and I didn't make this point at all during the first parlay, but it's a very good point that you bring up. One of the strongest points against all this detail is it's also pretty dehumanizing. Overly or under focusing on these details does make people look past, any human element or empathy or emotion in the piece. I'm going to follow up on that point with a concluding point of mine. But yes, that is a very good point that I'm glad you made. When making a digitized setting, take care not to fall into this trap is probably a more nuanced way to phrase what I was getting at. I guess this illustrates how muddy my thesis was. The fix for writing a bad example of a digital setting is not write an analog setting, it's write the digital setting better. This is probably just me figuring out why I wasn't enjoying certain things, and figuring out how to scratch that itch. I should probably start to frame it more as I appreciated this change of pace, or I'm struggling to find things in X subgenre. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you should feel bad or anything. I agree. You know, at the top of your comment when you said, I'm not saying all media is this way as much as saying sometimes media is this way, and here's why sometimes I find that unsatisfying. I'm tempted to point out that you actually did not add that nuance to some extent, but that's perfectly fine. Of course, whenever I read a statement like, I'm going to read something from your original prompt. Whenever you read a statement like, let's find an example. So here was one I took issue with in the first parlay. By scrubbing sensory hooks and human vulnerability out of our media, we're robbed of chances to empathize with the characters. There's kind of two like absolutisms there you could take issue with. By scrubbing sensory hooks and human vulnerability out of our media, by framing it that way, it's almost as if to say, and that is what's happening, and that is the thing that's happening, which you don't even agree. I don't agree that it is, but that's an interpretation of that, sure. We're robbed of chances to empathize with the characters. Again, that way of wording it makes it seem like the thing that you would get out of it is empathizing with the characters, and you do not get that thing, and the reason is this reason. But of course, when I read a statement like that, my responsibility is to understand that people just frequently word things that way. You should feel vindicated, Densoro, that I read Parley all the time that have statements like that in them, and I generally don't assume the person only thinks that thing. It is partially my fault, again, for basically feeling like I found a critical mass of details that made me think maybe you really do think that. I should respond to that, you know? But reading your parlay again, I don't think that, you know, it's perfectly understandable that you felt that way. And using parlay as a way to figure out like how to scratch that itch with these pieces of media, figure out why you weren't enjoying them, is a great use of parlay. Though I would argue if it was just down to that, that's not a good reason for a redo. If somebody asks for a parlay and it makes them realize this, but I interpreted things reasonably, we're not going to redo it. That's part of the purpose of parlay. That's okay. But in this case, I feel like that derailed it. A big point I wanted to make that this subject has brought up for me, because whenever I do parlay, one of the treats is I get to understand my own opinion about the subject better. It has to do with something that's been a quibble for me basically since the internet media age, like since YouTube getting, man, just talking about how long that's been makes me feel 30 years old, because that's how old I am. And when that YouTube started getting really popular, I think it was around then. Maybe it also had to do with people carrying around MP3 players and stuff, and podcasts getting popular. There's a word cloud of those things. I was in high school, college, when that was really kicking off. High school, people were, you know, being a YouTuber for a job, maybe for the first time a little bit. And a lot of the really popular people now first started making videos and maybe were not popular at all for a long time, for what little that means. Like 10, 15 years ago. I was writing a lot, through high school and college. Through school, I wrote a lot. And I have this big sticking point as a writer, as a creative, about things taking the form that makes sense for their context. So I'll explain what I mean. You want to write a book about this awesome paramilitary organization that defends the world from invaders from outer space. These people use a biological resource inside of the body, kind of like mana, to power weapons that they use to defend themselves against the aliens. Now, we're more numerous than the aliens, but the aliens have the technology, and so we have to defend against them and then adapt the technology and then recruit more people. And of course, it's going to be like mostly younger people that have the good amount of mana, because that's how it's done, because it's relatable to the target audience, or whatever. And that's all well and good, and that's the plot of World Trigger, the premise of World Trigger. And you want to write it as a book. You could write the story with a lot of action, but I would argue that action is just inferior in the written word. Like, you can still do it, there are benefits to doing it, but why do you want to write the story that way and as a book? You know what I mean? It feels like you, as the creator, you're insisting on two very specific things that specifically don't have synergy. Like you're insisting on the one of the very few anti-synergies between those two things. You want this and this, but you insist on doing the one thing that those two things don't do well together. That's how it feels to me. And I find myself reading or consuming a lot of media and thinking, this is just clearly not like, this is cool, but why did you make it a book? Or like, this is neat, but why is this an anime? And of course, the answer is often that it was a manga first. That's fine. I don't have a huge stick up my ass about this subject, by the way. Like, it's just something I think about a lot. You know, YouTube is an example. Oftentimes you see a video and I think, kind of feel like this is a 20-minute video, but you made the 3-minute version because you think and maybe are correct that it will get you like more views or something. I'm sure lots of you have thought this before. The recent topic where this is a hot subject is YouTube Shorts. People feel like they're seeing YouTube Shorts that really should be a longer video, but because YouTube Shorts perform well for various algorithmic and site structure reasons, people are shoehorning them into being a YouTube short. I think people are not, unfortunately, not seeing some of the YouTube shorts that don't do that, which I'm actually really enjoying. But lots of them are really bad, and I do think that is a significant part of why people aren't really picking a topic that fits in a minute. Though I would like to briefly express some sympathy, it's difficult to do that. But that means you should, if you wanted to make good videos, which in the first place isn't the priority for most channels, their priority is to make popular videos, not good videos. My priority is to make videos that you like. I wouldn't make this if my priority was to make popular videos, because this channel will never get lots of views. But the purpose of it is that it's cool, and Densoro did pay for it, so it doesn't have to get a lot of views. Who cares? People who want it can enjoy it. But my point is that for a lot of pieces of media, for a lot of designs in media as well, I feel like the person creating the design has put the design in a place that clashes with the form for no like extremely clear reason. Or I guess the clear reason a lot of time is probably they really want to make that idea, but they simply only have the option to make this form. And they're just not a creative person who has decided to think about ideas that take advantage of that form. And that's okay. To say you should only ever make, you know, X kind of story or whatever, because it fits this kind of media sounds limiting. Like, that sounds bad, but most people are not going to do this anyway. And I'm really talking about the opposite. I'm not talking about making the optimal fit. I don't think there really is that. What is the optimal movie topic? What? You know what I mean? Like, there's lots. My point is that there are a few that are just bad, in my opinion. And I don't really understand why there's such an insistence on doing them, I guess, except because it's for the sake of doing something different. I guess that's why, right? I guess I do know why. I don't know. I have a bad habit as somebody who often understands what's happening around them or has an explanation of saying, I don't understand blank thing that I intimately understand. I know exactly why that's happening. What I really mean is that's stupid and I don't like it. But I absolutely understand it. I don't know. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that a really good point Densora made was how adding a lot of detail to your designs. You used things like mecha shows as an example. Your mecha has boosters on its back, and so you can see where to target to disable its ability to fly. And that adds a lot of context to the combat and the drama of the series without requiring exposition, because you can see the exposition. The exposition is kind of carried by the visual design. It's contextualized that way. That makes sense. Because Bagpipe, to go back to my example from before, has those fort cracker shells in her hand in the plot of Arknights, where Bagpipe is a reasonably frequently featured character, pretty popular character for what it's worth. Bagpipe's cool. I like Bagpipe. It's frequently a point that she would need to like load the darn thing, or she is holding a spear that is longer than her like it's huge, you know. If people are kind of muscling in on her squad, it's often pointed out that, like, oh, hey, Captain, you said to detain these militants, but you may not have noticed that one of them has literally a battering ram in her hands. I physically cannot get to her because it's bigger than my entire body. That helps add context to, like, yeah, you can't just arrest this person. Like, what do you mean? Look at her. What are you gonna do? Just grab her? You know, that helps add context to the idea that you need to load the thing. It's got ammo you need. The shells are gigantic. It's probably not that easy to get more of them. The thing has massive recoil. She's not subtle at all. It's not like you're gonna go somewhere with her and people like don't know that there's somebody with a weapon, right? Like the weapon is as big as a missile. You know, she's not subtle. You can't hide. Very much what we talked about in the first parlay. There's no, you know, oh, we're all peace loving here. Like she's holding a lightning spear. The point is, having details like that helps add context to the setting and means that if you want less exposition, if you want less detail, if you want a streamlined story, like that is the optimal way to do it, basically, or one of the stronger ways to do it. Trying to make a story that has like a lot of nitty-gritty details, I think of maybe some parts of the plots of the Avengers movies, but that is still a piece of streamlined entertainment media, doesn't really make sense to have sleek, like detailless, not context adding character designs for that goal. There's a way in which like they're kind of trapped because they feel like they have to make those designs for the marketing, but then those designs don't add real context to what's going on. A really good example of this for me is Iron Man's design. Iron Man is cool. I think Iron Man is neat. He's cool. But the problem is that for him to look cool, the very thing that is going on with Iron Man is that he has a suit that hides almost all, very nearly all, of the detail, except for the arc reactor, I guess, of his abilities, so that it's an iconic design. But then there's very little way to add any context to his attacks. It doesn't really feel like you could fit all those things in his suit. Of course, that's kind of part of the fun. But for example, I don't think it has as much impact when, like, a thing that often happens in the Iron Man movies is a little rocket launcher will pop out of his shoulder, and it's cool to see the mechanism pop out. You know, it's not magic. But I guess my problem is that because all of that is hidden, Iron Man, and this is why the series has to deal with him the way that they do, I guess, can kind of just do anything, and there isn't a real way for the audience to feel like he did or didn't like run out of ammo or something. You know what I mean? There is no visual indicator of how many, you know, responses or like pieces of interaction or whatever Iron Man has. And so when he's out of something or he can't do something, it feels like, why? Like, why can't that just pop out? You know, it feels like things can just come out of the suit and do whatever he needs to do. Or, you know, there's a part that I recall where he uses these like cutting lasers to do an AoE around himself and kill a bunch of robots. And he then tells his co-star, oh, that's like a one-shot deal. You know, we can't do that again as easily. And you as the audience go, what? Why? You're a filthy rich, like, weapons dealer with a million different weapons inside of your suit, and you're telling me this one thing that kills everybody immediately, that's the thing that you can't do more of? Like, no. I'm sorry, that's just a little bit tone breaking to me. It's not necessarily a franchise that's about all these details, but I guess I'm just trying to say that's the drawback of doing that. This isn't a case where that's like the worst possible fit. Of course, as I said before, my whole niggling thing in high school about why do they make the media in such a suboptimal way? Like, there is no optimal way, whatever. But my point is just that a lot of the time these details end up in media, I think because there's some kind of possibly behind the scenes uh, like logic puzzle trap where like because we need to do these things and the the good way to do it would be these things, we're trapped with this where we kind of have to do 20% of the details in a way that is just sort of stupid, but there's nothing we can do. I don't know, and so I feel bad. I feel like there a lot of the time this complaint about media that Densoro and I have is moot. If you were to talk to the producer and they could be honest with you, which they probably can't, they would say, like, we absolutely had to do it that way. There was no choice. We didn't really choose to do it that way. We just had to do it that way because of a complicated series of factors that really don't have to do with art or it being good at all. Or, for one thing to go well, like marketing the characters, another thing can't go as well, like the believability or not of Iron Man having or not having some weapons. Again, to finish up the Iron Man point, a lot of people, myself included, began to feel like it was quite cheapening whenever he was part of the plot because he has this quality where he can just do anything you could conceivably achieve with any weapons technology an unlimited number of times, but also the writers can arbitrarily decide he can't for what is, in our practical minds, no reason. Like, they can say, oh, you can only do the one shot laser thing one time for what logistically is not a reason. Like, that is not enough of a reason. It's also a little silly because I said this isn't the kind of show where they talk about the number of bullets in your magazine or whatever. Yeah, but at the same time, they have the magical MacGuffin thing going on where there's some kind of unobtainium that they have to get to power the new weapon for the new robot villain or I don't know. The Avengers movies plots. My point is it kind of a little bit is that kind of series. So I also think that's sort of why they don't get away with it for me. But whatever. I mean, they're not really trying to market it to me anyway. And for what it's worth, I actually think that for taking the approach of going like the digital or sort of sleek, less details route, I think they did an okay job. Like they did an okay job having it feel like there is a plot or there like are mechanics. And the consequence is that cheapness when a character has a sort of mechanical way of working. I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's the biggest travesty ever. It's just not. I don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone is trying to argue that it's a cinematic masterpiece. I hope, except maybe from a logistics perspective, like that they even made that movie. All right, that's not what we mean though. Do I have anything else to say? Yeah, I guess a little bit more to close up this sort of optimal forms bit. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess so. For another example, in Arknights, those details that the characters use are a good fit for that piece of media for kind of two reasons. The first one is that these extremely standoutish designs, but that still have kind of down to earth like clothes and stuff, a sort of tactical athleisure is how Densoro worded it, and I've said that 3 times now because I think that's a good way to describe these pieces of clothing. It's like you're going to the gym, but we're also going to the club, but you're also in a paramilitary organization. See you at 7. Yeah, I would date Bagpipe. What I was trying to say was that was meant to stay in a thought bubble. It's a good fit for this kind of game because, one, it stands out from other media. It is a cool idea to have that type of aesthetic, but it also makes sense in this moment in history. Like, people will notice these designs better because that isn't a thing in the landscape right now. Limbus Company also has a similar thing. Like, compared to other games that are sporting this gigantic cast of characters they're heavily monetizing, these types of designs are a very favorable matchup. And then 2, this game has classes and subclasses. One really cool thing they do in Arknights is that subclasses generally share weapons. So Bagpipe is a pioneer. These are units that are good for their costs, they can come down early, and they speed up your ability to deploy other units in some way. But their total stats usually aren't that high. Bagpipe is broken, but besides Bagpipe, they're among the weaker units overall, but they're good for their cost, and they help you get to the other units. They hold the line. They're the Vanguard. And she is a Charger Vanguard. These generate deployment points when they kill an enemy. Charger Vanguards essentially all wield spears. That's just like an aesthetical detail where when you see a new character come out, aesthetical, all words are made up, and they have a spear. If you've played Arknights and you somehow didn't know about Bagpipe, but you'd seen a lot of other Arknights characters, you might know that this is a Charger Vanguard without being told. Or like the what's another example? The incantation medics, the lifesteal, but it heals your team. They do damage to enemies, and then that heals an ally. They all have briefcases. I don't know why, but they all have briefcases and like a staff. I don't know why that's what they chose, but that's what they have. The merchants all have like an item that isn't a weapon. So like they have a fan or cards or like a knife, like a normal boning knife, J, if you've played Arknights. That's kind of similar. They all have a thing that kind of isn't a weapon. That's like a mundane object. I'm trying to think of other ones just to give you examples because it's kind of fun. But you could look at them as a set and you'd see that all the Centurion guards have chainsaws. They attack all blocked enemies, so I guess they're like sawing through the whole group. We can get Bagpipe out of here as much as I'd love her to stay. You get the idea, and that's cool. And so it adds that bit of detail where you understand like how I guess they're going to do what they have to do, but it's also a good design idea for a game with so many different classes and subclasses because it helps the character. Just the character's design kind of tells you what they do a little bit, like as a gameplay mechanic. That's really smart. Like that's a good idea for this kind of game. Having characters whose appearance doesn't feel like it's connected at all to what they do feels like kind of a weird matchup for this type of game. A really good example is Fate Grand Order. You can't look at servants in Fate Grand Order and have any remote idea what class they are. That's a very common activity among people who enjoy the Fate franchise. They understand the premise of the servants and the classes, and then you show the people a servant design, usually from Fate Grand Order, and you try to guess what class it is, which is impossible. Like basically always completely impossible. It could just be anything. They don't really have anything to do with their class. That's okay. But you see what I mean when I say that's kind of a bad fit for a game where that would be kind of useful. It would help you tell them apart. It would be interesting for some visual cohesion. There's really nothing at all that makes, like, riders, for example, riders. The idea is that they ride something, that's part of their legend, or assassins, what makes an assassin class servant? The lore has plenty to say on that subject. People who enjoy the Fate franchise, don't type that in the comments, I know. But the point I'm trying to make is, visually, there really isn't anything tying those things together at all. There's nothing that really grounds the character in their mechanical identity. Now, by contrast, as a trade-off, Fate Grand Order heavily emphasizes having the character's character design explain their legend. It's often quite indirect until you hear the story explanation, sure. But a lot of the time it's quite clear, like, what kind of person they are, just not what kind of combat function they have, right? Which is fine, that's a trade-off, I guess. But you can see how that isn't a perfect fit. I guess, again, I'm kind of doing the same thing Densoro did to some extent. Rather than focusing on, it's really bad when they don't do it optimally or whatever, that's true. That's an interesting point, and that's fine. But I think it's useful to also reframe it as saying, it's just really good when people have found a really good fit, like that Arknights example. I really do think that that's subtle, but it has great synergy with the game as a whole. It's just one detail, but if you do everything in a piece of media that way, it really adds up. It really feels like every time something happens in this show or game, it's for a clear reason that makes the whole experience that little bit better. The worst parts are just much more baseline enjoyable. World Triggers filler is just that much less boring. The worst parts are still pretty good because it's just a series made with a lot of intention most of the time, I guess. I think that's why. And I feel like that's why I care so much about how or why the thing is made. To conclude, circle back to that point, the whole thing about, what it is, that doesn't really matter that much to me, is I think because you simply get tired of that. Once you've consumed enough like things that have a cool premise that you like, you will get tired of that. I really do think. I'm not really speaking to any of you, probably, maybe. That's fine. Like, it's not bad to enjoy those things. It's rude of people to act like it's stupid to like Sword Art Online because some people think it's bad. It doesn't matter. Like, you should enjoy it. But I think the more enduring benefit is to have pieces that just are good, basically. And then, people will like any premise. Premises are easy. Premises are cheap. You could make Sword Art Online good, and then the premise could also be fun. That's fine. By comparison, it's not that difficult to have a piece with a good premise. So I don't know. I guess to me, it's just sort of the only real merit. It's the only determining factor. Like, premises are just easy. To me, that's free. The thing that really determines why watch this instead of there's like 50 other anime that are about getting trapped in a video game, but you should watch this one because it's good. I guess it's silly to put it that way at the end, but that's what I mean. I think that type of craftsmanship matters. It adds up. It has lots of practical benefits. It's not just beneficial because it's like fun to see the atmosphere and detail in the world or whatever. That's really cool if you want to enjoy it, but it does have many practical benefits. And I've always been really caught up on this idea of things being in their optimal form. What's the way to do this that fits the form? Something that drives me crazy because I feel like I can't really give you good examples of this subject. It's just too core a part of my personality, so it's become a blind spot. But a simple example is when I answer parlay questions, I'm often driven mad by why they are the length they are. You know what I mean? Why is my answer to this length of video? Obviously there's lots of factors. It's how much thought I had about it at that exact moment, or what other parlay I did before, or I'm sure it's a tiny bit influenced by just how tired I am or whatever. There's nothing I can do about that. But it just seems arbitrary a lot of the time. Like, the amount I have to say about things doesn't feel like it lines up with anything. And it's crazing. It drives me mad because I want to give you what I see as the more optimal answer. Like, what's the best way to answer this question? And I feel like I don't do that at all. Like, I feel like I'm very bad at that. It's hard. Maybe I'm relatively good at it compared to other people, or other people even trying to be good at this. But that's something I really want to grow at with Parley. That is a personal goal of mine that I doubt many of you care about that much. But it matters a lot to me. I'm not sure it should, but it does. My hubris is showing, so we'll stop here. Thanks again for the very, very good prompt. We had a lot to say about this because there's a lot to say about it. It's an important subject. There's a lot to say about the way that media uses detail or the lack thereof to add context or not, and the various benefits and detriments that may have. I thought it was cool to get to spend so long talking about it. So thank you very much.